know she's done Legends of Ventura County, Strange Tales, Historic Railroads of Ventura County, Keys to the County, touring historic Ventura County. There was an article in the journal, Bird's Eye Views of Ventura in the late 19th century, that I found. And the newest book, Shifting Sands, which is the most appropriately named book I've run across in a long time. This is so true, and the shifting sands part has to do with, and I believe you're going to mention or explain the relationship of what happened back in 1960 and then what is happening today. So, without further ado, Cherie Grant.
All right, thank you for inviting me to speak at your annual meeting. And I know friends of the library do wonderful things to help support the library. Bravo for all that you do. Shifting Sands, the History of Channel Islands Harbor, is the title of my talk. And what is it with sand? Why does it always seem to end up where we don't want it? I know that Port Hueneme has been having a problem with not enough sand on your beaches, and recently Ventura Harbor was having a problem with too much sand in their harbor mouth. So it's an ongoing theme. The photographs that I'll be showing you today are from the book that I just recently wrote. It's at the printers right now. This is just a and it will be available in June at the Museum of Ventura County gift shop, and then eventually at the Maritime Museum gift shop too. So when I was researching this book, there were three kind of themes that I found of great interest. And I'm going to cover those today. One of them is what happens when you run up against the law of unintended consequences. Another one is what happens when you try a completely new philosophy of paying for something like a harbor, and it was called Pay As You Go. And the third theme was how the harbor was developed, and it was pretty much in three phases, roughly at 10-year increments. So that's kind of what I'll be looking at. So let's take a look at the part of the coastline that we're talking about. And it's basically from Santa Clara River down to Point Mugu. And of course the Native Americans were familiar with this section of coastline long before the Europeans got here. But in the 1500s, the natives, started to see European ships sailing up and down this coastline. The English came through, the Spanish came through, and the captains of every ship that came through immediately declared that all of that land our land belonged to the monarch of whoever was paying the bill. So we had a lot of exploration. Then in 1855, that was the first time that there was some actual measurements taken and studies done of this part of the coastline. The United States Survey of the Coast came through here, and they took drawings, they had descriptions, they took measurements, they found out how deep the water was, and it was very interesting. A couple of things that they noted. One, that a lot of sediment was coming down the rivers, and what they were talking about was what became the Ventura River and the Santa Clara River. They described sand dunes 60 to 75 feet high along this part of the coastline. And they mentioned two very interesting and unusual phenomena. One was an area just off the coast of Hueneme where fresh water came welling up through the salt water. And it turned out that that was due to an underground aquifer. Sailors knew about this later on because they could be anchored off the shore and replenish some of their fresh water without even having to go ashore. So that was one thing. The second thing that they mentioned was the deep underwater, the marine canyon right off Hueneme. And it was eventually measured at 1,200 feet deep, about a quarter-mile offshore, so right up next to the shore. And later there were descriptions by divers saying that the sides of that canyon were so steep that they couldn't stand on them. So it was this wonderful canyon. And of course that's what Thomas Bard was interested in, and that's why he built the wharf where he did. So then the heavy draft ships could come right up very close to the shore, and that helped bring more commerce to this area. Now, this was just kind of a lonesome area until the 1920s and Hollywood arrived. Rudolph Valentino was the heartthrob of the day, and they were going to make a movie that was supposedly set in the Sahara, so they were looking for some sand dunes. Oh, Oxnard just happened to have some. Bring in a few palm trees, and it looked like the Sahara. And so other companies started coming up, and this became the Oxnard Beach became a popular area for shooting movies. Right behind Hollywood came a few developers who thought, this looks like a pretty good place to buy some property, divide it up, and sell lots. And so there were like 3 phases of development of the coastline in the 1920s. And the first development was Hollywood Beach. The developer divided the lots up into petite little 35 by 70 foot lots with all the sand that you could handle. And then the next one was Silver Strand, once again the movie theme. And the last one developed was Hollywood by the Sea, and it had slightly larger lots. Unfortunately for this area, well, let me show you a great photograph of how popular it was at one point. In the newspaper it said that thousands of people actually came up to this area, came from different parts of Ventura County and LA County to look at buying a lot. So it was boomtown on Oxnard Beach. However, 2 things happened. One, Hollywood began to they went into talkies and began using sound stages, and so they weren't so interested in coming up to a location. And the second thing was the Depression hit, and so the land values plummeted and didn't recover for quite some time. Now, even though land values were not good after the 1920s, the developers were not the only people who had been looking at this area. Richard Bard had a real drive to have a harbor at Hueneme. When Thomas Bard died, who was his father, Richard took over the family businesses. And his vision was to utilize that deep submarine canyon and to make a harbor for Hueneme. And so he started working on that. And there were a lot of setbacks, a lot of perseverance. I'm not going to go into any of that, but Powell Greenland has written 2 wonderful books about that. One is Ventura County's Maritime Legacy, and the other one is called, Troubled Dreams, Richard Bard's struggle to build a harbor at Hueneme. And I recommend, if you're interested in this at all, I recommend reading those. They're excellent. Finally, in 1939, money was appropriated, and it looked like there was actually going to be a harbor. And here is the groundbreaking ceremony, I think it was in February of 1939. And you can imagine how excited and proud Richard Bard, who's in the middle with the shovel, was to get to that point. So they began bringing rocks up from Catalina Island on a barge and building the harbor and the jetties coming out from the harbor. And of course, that was when the historic event of moving the Victorian lighthouse from one side of the channel took place. And that was done by John Brakey, who was a house mover from Ventura. He was so proud of pulling that off, because it was a real feat, that on his tombstone he has a picture of the lighthouse being moved. And you can go to Ivy Lawn Cemetery and see his tombstone and see that picture of the lighthouse. So one thing that so in 1940 the harbor opened up and boats started to use it. Looked like everything was going to be just great. And then December 1941 arrived in Pearl Harbor. About 3 months later, the Navy knocked at Hueneme's door and said, "You have a lovely harbor here." The politicians and businessmen in Hueneme, from what I understand, did not want to sell the harbor. They wanted just to lease it to the Navy. However, the Navy bought the harbor. And so they paid a little over $2 million, retired the bond issue that had been done to fund the harbor, and they owned the harbor. And for Richard Bard, this must have been a really bittersweet moment, because on the one hand, here he'd worked for years to come up with this harbor. He'd been successful. They were starting to use it, and it disappeared from their use. On the other hand, as far as the war effort, the Navy was moving into a kind of a turnkey operation. Here was this beautiful harbor. It was finished. It was ready to go, and it became a very vital part of the Pacific War effort. During the war, it was the second busiest harbor on the West Coast. So it was kind of a good news, bad news time for them. During the mid-1940s, the Army Corps of Engineers began to notice something happening. And this is where the law of unintended consequences comes in. Because before the harbor, let's see, go to show you this way. Before the harbor was built, of course, all the sediment came down the river to the river mouth, and the sand would come down the coast and replenish Hueneme Beach. Well, when this harbor was designed, they designed it perfectly for navigation, which meant they put, it's kind of hard to see because it's so light in here, but there are two breakwaters coming off there, and they were right on the edge of the submarine canyon. Unfortunately, after that was constructed, the sand would come down the coast, and then instead of continuing on to Hueneme Beach, it would go out the edge of the jetty and then plummet down into the submarine canyon, never to be seen again. So by the mid-1940s, they were realizing that there was a real problem, and one report said that Hueneme Beach had lost 1,000 feet of coastline already. So what do we do about that? Well, different ideas were bandied about. And one idea was to build another harbor that would have a sand trap. That way, the sand could be trapped and then piped down to Hueneme instead of all getting lost in the canyon. Where to build the harbor? There were three locations that were the most popular. One was at Hollywood by the Sea. Another one was at Ventura, because Ventura wanted a harbor. And it's interesting that the Army Corps of Engineers report that was analyzing these different locations said that that might not be a good location because of the Santa Clara River, and there might be some flooding possibilities there. Well, if anybody has been around, was around in 1969, you know that they were right. The other location was Ormond Beach. And so there was a lot of discussion and public testimony and hearings and so on before they decided. And they finally decided that Hollywood by the Sea was the best location. Now this is a little later photograph, and it does show, there's the breakwater, and there is just the start of the channel for Channel Islands. So you can see its relationship. There was, of course, problems again with getting funding, but they were able to get some government funding. And in 1960, things started to move ahead. The Army Corps of Engineers had the contract to build the new harbor. And they brought in a big dredge called Los Angeles, and they started digging. And once they got the channel dug, then they started taking out the sand from the inside and shipping that down the coast, which was welcome. And by 1961, they were done with the first part of the harbor. It was about 82 acres that they dug out. And so the dredge packed up all their pipes, took off, and a quiet settled over the area, because all they had at this point was a big hole in the water. I mean, a big hole in the sand that was full of water, and not much else. Well, of course, right away, boaters wanted to get in and start using this harbor, and because there was no riprap on the sides of the channels, the county ended up putting a boom across the channel to keep the boaters from using the harbor. So they had to leave it there until they could come up with the money to protect the sides of the harbor so that they didn't erode. Now, how are we going to pay for all the improvements that are needed to turn this into a real harbor? And that is where the second theme comes in, which is pay as you go. There was a lot of discussions about whether, well, actually a bond issue was passed, and then it was decided that there wasn't enough revenue going to be coming in to pay for it, and so it was never sold. And the question was private enterprise or public funds? How are we going to do this? And the county decided to try private enterprise. And there were several people who really pushed that idea and are responsible for helping make that a success. So here is what they decided that they wanted to have for the harbor. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but here's the channel. These are boat slips. There's the peninsula. And then along on this side, and they've got a whole list here of what they would like. Marinas, fuel dock, apartment houses, a restaurant, I mean, pretty much all the things that they ended up getting eventually. But they didn't have any money to do this, so it was a good plan. This is 1962. In the August of 1962, Thomas Volk was hired to be the harbor director. And he came from Santa Monica. He'd been, the harbor at Santa Monica, he'd been very successful with working with private enterprise down there. And he felt that he could enroll business people to put up structures in the harbor and invest in what was going to happen there. And so the plan was that the county would own all of the land, would not sell any of the land, and private enterprise would put all of the improvements on it. And then they would pay a lease and also a percentage of business. So the first bid that went out was for a marina, and it was called Channel Islands Marina. And Jim Donlin, who was part of the Oxnard-Donlin family, but he was an engineer, not a farmer, and Bud Farrell were partners in the company that won the bid for the first marina. And they came up with a new method of construction that used cement caissons and then the decking on top. And that turned out to be a very successful way of building. And here's Jim Donlin. This is after they built the first 80 slips so he could relax a little bit, sitting there enjoying the day with his newspaper, his drink, and his feet in the water. Now, the second bid went to Seacoast Marine, because you need a chandlery in the new harbor. And Norman Bacon was the person who won the bid to put up the chandlery. In the meantime, Ventura had built a harbor in 1962, and so he already had a facility up at Ventura. He had another one in Santa Barbara. So he knew what he was doing, and he put in this one. Later, Fred Binger bought Seacoast Marine and changed the name to Coast Chandlery. And so he carried that on for years after that. So that was another important part of having the harbor work. Later, now where Seacoast Marine was is where the Maritime Museum is right now. It was originally Port Royal restaurant, you remember that? Well, Seacoast Marine built there because no restaurant had bid to come in. Eventually, a restaurant did bid to come in, and the county told Coast Chandlery that they had to move. So they moved up harbor, and Fred Binger and his partners built the Marine Emporium. And here is the groundbreaking Marine Emporium. And this is Tom Volk, harbor director, and in the back here, the tall, good-looking guy with the mustache is Fred Binger. So that was an exciting moment. The Marine Emporium, it had Coast Chandlery, it had Windward Sails, it had Shipwreck Willie's Deli. I mean, there were all kinds of facilities right there, and there were a lot of good times at Coast Chandlery. I lived in the harbor for about 5 years on a boat, and I remember Coast Chandlery.
You're not going to tell us that, though, are you?
No. This is the first restaurant that showed up in the harbor, and it was called Channel Clipper. Jim Johnston and Wayne Troxell had built a boatyard and a restaurant up in Ventura Harbor. The restaurant became the Scotch and Sirloin, which some of you may remember. Yeah, and then it came back and so on. And they won the bid to build a restaurant here, and it went in right next to where Seacoast Marine was. So Jim, his wife, Katie Johnson, and Wayne Troxell were partners in this restaurant. And they owned it for a few years and then eventually sold it to Howard Conant, and he changed the name to the Whale's Tail.
Oh my goodness.
So that's where that came from. And Katie has a lot of funny stories about the people who came into the Channel Clipper for drinks or dinner or whatever, and it was very, very popular. She was talking about John Carradine, who used to live in the marina, and she said when he'd get snockered, he'd start reciting Shakespeare,
Yeah.
and the place would clear out.
He was good, too.
Yeah. And Dan Blocker, who played Haas on what was it, Bonanza,
Bonanza.
yeah, used to come in too. When the Johnstons and Wayne Troxell sold the Channel Clipper, they took a bottle from the bar, and they called that the Last Man bottle. And they said whoever survived of the three of them would get to drink that. So here's Katie and Wayne with the Last Man bottle. Now, unfortunately, Jim Johnston died a couple of years ago, I guess, and a few months ago, Wayne Troxell died. So I need to call Katie and ask her if she's broken the seal on that bottle. Once they had, let's see, rats, I wish we could see this better. Let me just explain it to you. This is the sand trap, right here. And then here is kind of where they put the boom before they were allowing boats to come into the harbor. And you can see some of the marina is built, the slips are there, and across the way there's some business. But see how small the harbor is? Yeah. A lot of it has not been dredged out yet. So the businesses kept coming in, they go out for bids pretty soon. We had Jack Ward, the Cisco landing, he brought his sports fishing boats in. There was a fuel dock. There were, let's see, a couple of other boating businesses. There was the chandlery, and the marina Channel Islands Marina kept building more slips. So things were coming right along. And then Martin B. Smith, Bud Smith, saw opportunity. And this is when they are getting ready to, in 1965, they're getting ready to break ground on the peninsula, because that was kind of the next part that got developed. Oh, and I meant to tell you, it's interesting, the name of the harbor was Ventura County Harbor at Oxnard. Now that's a mouthful, isn't it? And nobody ever remembered that, and they confused it with Hueneme and so on. And so Captain Oakley, who was a famous sailor down the harbor, suggested that they have a naming contest. And so they did, and the name that won was Channel Islands Harbor. Thank goodness. So Bud Smith had a deal where, because the peninsula had absolutely no infrastructure whatsoever, so he put in the utilities, the roads, the sewer systems, and started building his restaurants and motel and the apartments. So in 1965, Memorial Day, I think it was, they decided to have a big celebration for the harbor. And so this is, on the left is Robbie Robinson, who was a Ventura County supervisor, and Ed Carty in the middle. He was mayor of Oxnard and then became county supervisor, and the Army Corps of Engineers official on the right. I'm wondering, you know, I guess they didn't trust Ed Carty. He's got his trident, but it's got something over the tine, so it doesn't run into anybody. Yeah. In case they had a few drinks.
Just in case.
Yeah. And there were, of course, dignitaries all over the place, and speeches, and all kinds of activities. This is Richard Gard. And imagine how proud he must have felt. Here was the second harbor that he had been involved with, and it was going to be another success. So that's Juan Cabrillo on the left. You recognize him. And wait a minute, let me go back. This is Victor Maserati. Any of you remember him? I think wasn't he called the Prime Minister of the Peninsula?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was in charge of a lot of Martin Smith's operations and very convivial person. And here's a couple of other party goers who came for the celebration. So you've got
Yeah,
Tom
it is
Bull,
John Wayne.
Bob Tremaine, who was with the Oxnard Chamber of Commerce, and Big Maserati. And who's that big dude in the background? John Wayne, yeah. It's not a very good picture, but he, of course, spent a lot of time at Channel Islands Harbor.
Something goose or something?
Here's another shot. I think it's just interesting because of the huge dredge in the background. Ed Carty was always a big supporter of the harbor, and Tom was excellent, from what I understand, at lining up businesses to invest in the harbor and setting up the leases and so on. So they did a good job. Now you can see they have part of Villa Serena. The apartments are built. We've got all kinds of slips. There's over here on this side is Drake Craft. Larry Drake came up from Huntington Beach and set up a boat yard here. But look at how much is left to develop.
What year was
This
this?
is about 1967. Yeah.
5 years.
Yeah. Now, here's what Smith kept working on. Of course, the lobster trap. That was such a popular place for years. And it was like one of the top places to go for something special. And the coffee shop next door. Those were the days when we dressed up to go out to eat.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the hotel.
Casa Serena.
The Casa Serena. Now, one of the last things that went in as far as infrastructure in the harbor was the launch ramp. And you can see that was a very popular thing to go in. They must be trying to see how many people they need on that before they can sink the dock. And one of the things that was fun about the harbor is there was a lessee association, and they worked to organize all the different events that happened. And so they would have harbor days once a year, usually 4th of July weekend or Memorial Day weekend. And a lot of the old classic boats would come from other areas, and you could go down, just walk up and down the docks and see all the neat boats. And they would have things like different events. They'd have water skiing in the harbor and races and all kinds of fish fries and whatnot. And they would do, and I really remember these, the 10-man row out and the Ironman race. And with the Ironman race, the skipper had to row out to his boat anchored out here in a dinghy with one oar, get on the boat, raise the anchor, sail it around a course, come back, drop anchor, and then row back to the dock. And you can imagine there were a lot of wet sailors.
Inside now.
Yeah, inside and out, exactly.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So this is the second phase of development, and it's kind of hard to, okay, let's see if we can. Here's the peninsula. You can see that Villa Serena is just about done. This is the Edison Canal. This is Channel Islands Boulevard, but it's not really yet because there's no bridge. And they're starting to dredge for Mandalay Bay. And in the background you can see, look at that. None of that is developed yet. And that was in 1970. And here it is a couple of years later. In 1971, they finished Channel Islands Bridge. And this is after the bridge was finished. There's the bridge. You could see that they're starting to build Anacapa Isle Marina. But there are two big pieces of harbor that haven't been developed yet. One is over here, just south of Townlands Boulevard, and the other one is over here. Anybody know what went in there?
Yeah.
Fisherman's Wharf, yep,
Uh,
yeah. This was the last big development that Martin Smith did. And remember, it had Castagnola's restaurant, and there was a fresh fish market, and just a lot of things there. It was a really fun place to go because there was so much activity. Studio Gallery, Joanna Steele. So that was his last big development. So that took care of that corner. And then the next thing was phase 3, which was this here. And so the Pacific Corinthian Yacht Club went in here, and then a lot more slips went in where they dredged out that last little bit. And that pretty much completed the harbor after all those different phases. So in 1985, they had a centennial celebration, did all the kind of activities that they've done 20 years before, and this is John Flynn speaking to the crowd. Mike Bird was a reporter for the Oxnard Courier, and he sent a letter to be read because he couldn't come. And one of the things he did was he listed all the different watering holes that people had enjoyed going to over the years in Channel Islands. Like Lucille's and the Wigwam and Waikiki and the Dunes, but he didn't mention the Rudder Room. And if anybody knows the Rudder Room, I don't know how he could have missed that. So I pretty much ended this in 1985. Tom Volk left the county after many, many years. He'd been there since 1962. In 1986, and the Harbor District was folded into the General Services Administration, so that was a huge change in a lot of ways. And then, of course, a little bit later, Martin Smith sold all of his investments in the harbor, and that was another big change. So I think it's kind of in a real flux right now. Part of the harbor is, at least the east side is, and so we'll have to see what happens. But it's just amazing. It was, in response to a problem that was created by Hueneme Harbor, and they came up with this idea. They made it pay as it went, so that it really has been a moneymaker in the past for the county. And it took a lot of perseverance, but they came up with something that was a real jewel for Ventura County.
I'm here. Thank you very much, Cherie. That was really, really good. And I think most of us remember a lot of those places that were there. Now, let's go to the present. And the present is we're in big trouble right here in Hueneme.
Oh boy, that's
Because this time we're not getting the allotment that we need for the sand. Usually we've been getting between 60, 70, 80%. This time it's going to be 25%.
Wow.
The last time we got, I think, 41%. The water came, we lost the beach up until the picnic tables. So if this 25% happens, we will not have Surfside Drive, we won't have Ormond Beach, and we're going to have problems at Hueneme. So John Sharkey, who happens to be related to me, so I could press him into service. But I know that we also have all the rest of the Hueneme Council here too, that will be happy to answer questions for you about what's being done.
Don't be alarmed. How many of you are big fans of littoral geomorphology?
Oh, what?
There's at least one back here. Now, nobody raised their hand, but I know you are, because I get phone calls and I get emails and say, what's going on with the beach? How come it's washing away? Well, as Cherie pointed out, those pictures were great and very illustrative of what happened. What we wound up with after the jetties came in, and let's talk a little bit about how beaches work, because here, and Cherie talked about this too, it's like a river of sand that moves down. And if you stick something and block that flow, you're blocking that river. And this is very hard for people on the East Coast to understand. So when we go back to Washington and talk to our congressman from Kansas, because they have relatively stable beaches, and but they do get a hurricane. Yeah, they just had a hurricane. So they're used to dealing with emergencies. We know how fast the sand is moving down the coast. And once the jetty was put in there, and I know Helen remembers this, and there's a few others here probably remember, where the shoreline settled was right up about where the railroad tracks are. So all of Surfside, the whole Surfside neighborhood, is sand that was taken out of Channel Islands Harbor when they dredged that. And you know, Bill Miranda, the first city manager in Port Hueneme, used to talk about, well, you know, if we had a layer of sand that was 3 feet deep, 6 feet wide, went all the way to Santa Paula, that's how much sand they took out to make Surfside, the Surfside neighborhood. What we need to understand about this Channel Islands Harbor is this is an engineering, it's like a machine. It's designed to hold a certain amount of sand up there, and it has to be pumped around every 2 years. Well, the way it's working now is we have to go back in the budget every 2 years, and we have to get this in the Corps of Engineers, and they have to get enough money, and the cost of dredging keeps going up. Getting money in the budget gets harder and harder. So this year, of course, you know, sequestration, this is not sequestration, by the way, it's something else altogether. But it's the same atmosphere. Oh, we're going to cut the budget. And those, you know, not to pick on the folks from Kansas, but the congressman from Kansas says, hey, we can cut this budget. That's just those rich folks out in California, so it's not going to hurt. But the problem is, if we don't have the money, then we can't move the sand. We're not short of sand. We got plenty of sand. It's sitting in the sand trap. And if there's too much sand, then that blocks up the entrance to the harbor, Channel Islands. So it has to move. So the struggle we've been going through this year is to get what we call mid-cycle replenishment. It's designed to be pumped every 2 years. You know, the Corps of Engineers comes along, they hire a dredging company, and every 2 years they move 1.2 million cubic yards of sand, and it takes care of us for the next 2 years. Well, this year, because we didn't get enough, we got to come back in the middle. Now, as a taxpayer, this really bothers me because it costs the guys $2 million to set up the dredge. Every time they move it, it's $2 million. So they got to come back again and do it again. That's not very efficient. So right now we've been in daily contact, and you know, over the years, and this is not the first time this has happened, by the way. Every so often, you know, oops, something happened. We didn't get quite enough money. We're not going to move quite as much sand. Senator Box has been working on this for a long time with us. Our congressional delegation, Elton Gallagher, Lois Capps, and now Julia Brownlee, we're thoroughly engaged on this. We're talking to folks in Washington just about every day. We're going to be meeting with the Corps of Engineers coming up here in the next few days. I expect that we're going to get some money for mid-cycle replenishment. So that'll take care of us until the next one comes along, which, you know, will be another year. But here's what I've been thinking for the last 20 years now. Why do we have to fight this battle every 2 years? Isn't there a better way to do this? Can't we either stabilize the funding or come up with some kind of engineering solution that slows down the flow of sand? We can't stop it, because if we stop it, then Point Magoo washes away. And when was it they lost the building down there in 1996 or something like that? Yeah, mid-90s. So the sand has to move. The question is, can we have it move slower? Can we build up reservoirs of sand so that if we do get shorted, we're not going to be in an emergency situation? Those are long term. We're going to solve this year's problem this year, and I'm reasonably confident we can do that. One other thing that's very interesting, if you go down there, you see those rocks down there that are exposed now?
Yeah.
That was actually go back to the 1950s.
You bet. Yep.
That predates the Coastal Act. That was that was a revetment that was there, and it's kind of deteriorated. So we're exploring the option of saying, hey, this is an existing revetment. The Coastal Commission doesn't like seawalls and things like that. Oh, well, revetment's like a seawall, a bunch of rocks that act as a seawall. And we're seeing if we can do this as a repair to an existing structure. We're exploring ways to get money to do that and all that. But that would protect the street at least. So when we do get these emergency situations, it won't be so bad. Is this serious? Yes, it's serious. Should we, panic? No, panic is never a good thing. I really believe that we are going to come up with a solution for this year. And what I hope to do before I die is get some kind of more stable situation so that we don't have to have these emergency situations, because it's just dumb. It's really dumb, and it costs us taxpayers a lot of money, and it's really hard for all of us. So that's where we are right now. And President Kelly, do you want us to take over? Take over. I don't know if anybody has any questions or anything.
I'm your queen. Okay. Any questions that you have of either the speaker or the council? They're at your disposal. Yes.
Yeah, question for the council. How come with the last dredging that they did, it was a waste of money? What they did, it was washed away in like a few months. They just finished doing it.
Yeah, this recent one they just did?
Yeah. It's all
Well,
gone.
that's because they didn't have enough money to move enough sand.
So they shouldn't have done it then, because now we're paying double.
Pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
We have to pay for the dredging again, $2 million. They have
Yeah,
to come back
yeah,
and
yeah.
do that, and what are they gonna do? Another Band-Aid instead of a fix?
Yeah, we're supposed to get, well, actually, the engineering spec calls out for 1.8 million cubic yards. We've been getting about 1.2, that seems to work. We got about 300,000 this time.
Okay.
We got about
Oh, we didn't
1/4
get
we're supposed to get.
Yeah.
And so and the engineers look at it and say, well, where are we gonna put it?
Right.
We'll put it down here, because that'll solve that's the most immediate need, right there.
Yeah.
But if you get all the sand, then they can build a bank up in back of the jetty, and
Yeah.
over the 2-year period, it comes down. You're right. I mean, it's just like, why do they do this?
Because what you said, like you said, that from 1950, it's
Yeah.
exposed now. You can see
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right. That's it. And it's very, very frustrating, because like I say, it's dumb. D-U-M, dumb.
Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Kathy.
John, you said it cost $2 million to set up all that stuff to
Uh-huh,
begin with.
that's what they say.
How much more does it cost to actually move the sand?
Well, we're talking $6 to $8 million.
Oh,
I mean, it's not an inconsiderable amount of money.
Wow.
And that's why, back in 2001, we had an item that was going through committee to do what's called a reconnaissance study for the Corps of Engineers, to see if there's some kind of engineering thing we can do, put some kind of structure out there, change the way we do the sand, change the shape of the jetty, that kind of thing that would help us. That was going through committee, and then 9/11 happened, and all the money went away. And I keep bringing it up for the last 12 years now. I keep bringing it up. We need. It has to be studied before you can do anything, because we don't know what's going to happen downstream. But that's one of the things that Yeah, it's cost a lot of money. And by the way, the Navy's paying 35% of this. And I don't know how they came up with that percentage, but they did. Because it affects the Navy. It's why we're not like anywhere else in the country. Is because this is caused by a facility that's owned by the federal government, by the United States Navy. So that's, if your neighbor did something to your yard, you'd go say, hey, you're washing my yard away with your building there. We can't exactly do that with the Navy, but it's recognized that this is caused by a federally owned structure. So it's not like, gee, this would be nice, because it's not a natural situation. It's caused by something that the federal government owns.
Is the power plant or the Magoo Lagoon area, are they complaining yet about what's had occurred this time? Since they didn't put very much sand out this last time, are they noticing already, or it takes a while?
Well, it takes a while. It's like a bubble that
Yeah.
moves down, and whether it'll be, how it'll impact them, I don't know. I mean, clearly there's environmental questions down there. There's the power plant. There's the Navy. There's a number of interested parties here that we're trying to marshal them all and have everybody working together on this. That's enough of me.
Any more questions, comments? Well, you see the camera here. We are all being filmed, and this is going to be on KABY television. It's going to be broadcast, tonight?
No, it's
It's
internet.
being broadcast
It's
right
there
now.
now, right.
So let your friends and family know that you could log in here. I'll give you this little thing if you want to. Tell your family and friends to tune in. And I think it's archived, right? So you can go online and see it all over again. Thank you so much, Cherie. What a wonderful, can we have some applause for